At first light, the Pacific looked harmless, a sheet of hammered copper breathing under a sky so clean it felt sharpened. On the carrier's deck, men moved like the second hand of a clock, precise, inevitable. The new fighter crouched near the catapult, broad-shouldered, ungainly, paint still smelling of factories and distance. The mechanics called it many things: pig, iron cat, big-boned Grumman, but the name that stayed was Hellcat, a plane that didn't ask to be loved, only trusted. Baker wiped his palms on his flight suit and glanced at the wings. 6.5s waited in each, their bays closed like lips holding back a hard truth. He wasn't a poet. He was a farm kid who'd traded seasons for sorties. Yet even he sensed the quiet promise in the metal. Not grace, not beauty, survival. "Remember," the instructor had said, tapping a chalkboard map that set islands like teeth across the blue. "The Zero is a knife in a dance. You are a hammer falling from a rooftop. Don't dance." They'd all heard the stories. How when 42 men went up in Wildcats and came back chastened or not at all. How the Zero could turn inside anything that flew, a dragonfly with a sting. The Japanese aces had names that carried with them like weather. To Baker, they were rumors wrapped in silk, until the rumor learned to track, to lead, to fire. Across the water, Lieutenant Sato pressed his gloves flat, smoothing a crease that was not there. He had flown at Midway, over the Solomons, had felt American tracers stitch the air so clumsily he almost pitied them. He loved his Zero as a man might love a blade, kept it oiled, respected its temper, believed it had a spirit. The new American fighter, he'd been told, was simply a wildcat that had eaten too much. He smiled at that. Heavy planes made heavy mistakes. The carriers rolled and pitched on swells that felt personal. Engines coughed, then found their chest voices. Deck crews waved paddles, small commanders in the theater of the sea. Baker's Hellcat shuddered as the catapult slammed it forward, a punch to the spine that never quite hurt. The wheels lifted, the ship fell away, and a horizon unfolded like a secret. In the climb, he felt the difference immediately. The engine dug its heels into the air and pulled. The cockpit felt armored, inevitable. He thought of the Wildcat stories, the ones that ended with words like couldn't and couldn't quite. The Hellcat, by contrast, had a yes in it, even if it wasn't a pretty yes. He swallowed, checked instruments, looked left and right. His wingman Flaherty lifted 2 fingers. Ready. Far ahead, Sato saw them first, dots against the bloom of morning. He flared his formation and let the eager ones break off. No need for lectures. The sky would teach. The Americans always came to turn. They could not resist. The Zero was built to tempt them the way a matador tempts a bull. Sato rolled, angled, waited for the mistake. But the mistake did not come. The 2 big Grummans did not slice into a circle. They climbed through, then rolled down. Sun behind them, weight under them. Sato's eager number 3 flinched into a horizontal turn, and the Hellcats declined the invitation with a kind of brutal politeness. They plunged fast enough that the air felt like a tightened wire, and Baker saw the Zero widen in his windscreen like a memory returning. Lead, breathe, squeeze. The guns spoke without drama. No brass fanfare, just a braided roar that pinned the morning to its place. Tracers reached and found the Zero's shoulder, then its belly, then a spark caught something that wanted to burn. The plane rolled once as if to look back at itself, then folded. Baker pulled through the dive and felt the Hellcat's weight turn from enemy to ally. He did not gloat. He did not cheer. He only said into the mic, "Splash," like a man noting rain. Sato registered the kill as a door closing somewhere far away. He slid his Zero vertically, feeling for the edge of a stall, and came down the hill toward the American who had fired. The Hellcat held its energy like a secret under the skin. Interesting, he thought. Not clumsy at all. He tried the old seduction, offering a flat turn, just a taste, and the Grumman refused again, unromantic, patient. The American climbed instead, then tipped the nose and came again from above. This, Sato admitted privately, was new. Later, when the fight scattered like confetti, when Sato guided his damaged Zero back toward the thin idea of a runway, he composed the report in his mind. The enemy has introduced a fighter that prefers to dive and strike rather than turn and linger. It is robust. It absorbs punishment like a large man absorbs an insult, by smiling and returning the favor. Recommend changes in tactic. Do not chase uphill. Do not let the sun invite them to the party. On the carrier, Baker's boots hit deck. He was shaking and maybe grinning and trying not to. Crewmen slapped the fuselage as if to wake it from a hard dream. The Hellcat wore the scuffs like metals, fuel smell, hot oil, voices that had learned not to be too loud for the sake of the ones that wouldn't be hearing them again. "You didn't turn," Flaherty said, tugging off his helmet. "I remembered the rooftop," Baker answered, "and the hammer." The Pacific, indifferent, breathed. Somewhere beyond that easy horizon, the next hunt idled, ready. The Hellcat waited with the patience of a tool that knows exactly what it was made to do. The morning the Admiral sent them west felt like a dare. Briefing room lights buzzed, maps bristled with pins, and the weather officer promised a sky clean enough to hurt your eyes. "We'll be over the target 8 minutes," the CO said, tapping a penciled circle. "That's 8 minutes longer than they plan to let us stay." Keep your altitude. Keep your wingman. Keep your head. Altitude is a bank account. Spend only to kill. The sentence lived in Baker's bones now. He and Flaherty climbed in a loose weave, their shadows playing chase across the sea. The Hellcat didn't sprint so much as persist. It reached up and stayed there. Below, the carrier group drew chalk lines in the water and erased them again. The first specks at their 12 were not zeros at all, but float planes trying hard to be scouts. Baker felt the old itch, to dive, to collect an easy victory, but he heard the admonition like a hand on his shoulder. Don't chase the decoy down the stairs. He rolled a little, kept the sun tucked under a wing, and watched the specks decide to be elsewhere. They found the real fight over an island that looked unfinished, a scraped knuckle of coral and runway. Flack began to knit a sweater in the sky. Black puffs, then white, then a sound that your body felt before your ears admitted it. The dive bombers behind them started their solemn procession downward, gulls that had learned geometry. Baker's job was simple: make sure the procession stayed solemn. Sato was there, his zero bright in the clean light, and with him a young pilot named Aoki, who had hands as quick as birds. Aoki wanted the kill he'd been promised by the stories of 42. He rolled toward a Dauntless, certain the American fighter would try to spiral in and tangle. But the Grumman stayed high, patient, watchful, the dog that refuses to chase the stick. When Aoki committed to his run, the stick moved. The Hellcat piped in from above with the decisiveness of a judge. Baker felt the dive tighten the muscles in his neck. He eased forward just enough to keep the sight honest. The range shrank. He let the guns chew a short sentence into the sky. The Zero twitched, then flared smoke like a bad idea leaving a room. A parachute tumbled open. Too late. Too low. He looked once, then looked away. The worst part of surviving was how quickly your habits protected you from the things that might keep you human. Sato caught the Hellcat in a crossing merge and saw, to his surprise, no panic in the American's posture. The Grumman rolled smartly, not fast, but final, and refused every invitation to turn flat. It was like fighting a man who wouldn't step into your preferred light. He slipped vertical, hung for a breath where the world goes soft, then kicked into a slashing pass. Tracers stitched along the Hellcat's wing route and sparked like flint on iron. The American shrugged and climbed anyway. Armor, Sato thought. Weight used correctly. A lesson. Baker felt the hits as a dull knocking far from home. Gauges were good enough. Structure was good enough. He was still king of the hill, which was all that mattered. He called a tally, rolled, and came down the long slope of advantage. The sight drifted, settled, held. He squeezed and felt the .50's turn recoil into certainty. Bits came off the zero like notes from a torn page. It slid away, then tried to rise, then did not. Flack reached for him with a rude hand. He jinked. Not beautifully, but urgently. The Dauntlesses finished their work with a grim kindness, planted their iron where men had arranged to meet it, and hauled the noses up with that preposterous slowness dive bomber pilots cultivate to cheat gravity. The sky became a storm of choices. Go here and you live. Go there and you do not. By the time the formation gathered itself again, the island's runway wore new scars, and the defenders spoke to one another in clipped syllables. Sato landed in a zero that no longer flew straight. He let the wheels kiss dirt that pretended to be a runway, and taxied with the abstraction of someone who has put a question aside for later, the kind of question with teeth. In the ready room, Baker poured coffee that tasted like a spare part. He held the mug, and the mug held a little heat, and for a moment that felt like victory. Flaherty sat across from him and tried a grin that almost worked. "They said turnfight demons," Flaherty muttered, "but they bleed like anything else." Baker set the mug down. "They're pilots," he said. "So do we." Word flowed ahead of them across the fleet. The Hellcat was not pretty. It did not sing in a turn. It made a different kind of music, drums and boots, and a riff too heavy for the old ears. The Japanese would adapt. They always did. But the shape of the sky had changed. The dance floor had tilted. And somewhere in the ledger that only history keeps, the math began to favor the hammer. Outside, the evening smoothed the sea into mercy. The deck crew chalked wheel lines like caretakers. Men laughed too loudly and then fell silent without embarrassment. A wind moved through the open hatches as if the carrier itself were taking a breath. The Hellcat stood in a neat row, patient as oxen, engines ticking as they cooled. Tools with the humility to wait for orders and the appetite to carry them out. The ocean slept that night in uneasy rhythms. Somewhere below the horizon, thunderclouds rolled without rain, the kind of sound sailors learned to respect. On the carrier, lights were dimmed to red. The deck smelled of oil and salt and something older, anticipation. Baker sat on his bunk, turning his helmet slowly in both hands. The inside smelled like leather and nerves. He had flown 5 sorties now, 5 and still breathing. That was what passed for luck in the Pacific. Every man on the ship measured his own future in that same silent arithmetic. Flaherty was scribbling on a scrap of paper. "For my kid," he said when Baker glanced. "If we come back, it's a letter." "If not, it's a message," Baker nodded. "What do you even write?" Flaherty smiled without showing teeth. "That I did my job. That the cat flew true, that I wasn't afraid, at least not all the time." Above them, the ship's loudspeaker crackled, a voice calm as a metronome. "Pilots, ready room in 10. Mission briefing 0500. Targets, Palau airstrip and secondary harbor installations." The room exhaled as one. Boots scuffed the floor. Someone told a joke no one heard. In the ready room, the map waited like an accusation. The air officer traced a pencil along a line of attack. "Enemy air strength moderate. Expect zeros, possibly a few twin-engine interceptors. Remember your altitude discipline. Hellcats cover the dive bombers and—" He tapped the edge of the map. "Don't chase them home. That's where they keep the flak." The men nodded, pretending the word flak didn't already live behind their ribs. That night, Baker couldn't sleep. The ship rocked gently, a mother's motion with a murderer's promise. He thought of home, of the Iowa field where he'd first watched clouds as if they were maps. He remembered the old biplanes that used to drone over county fairs, painted like candy, and how he'd stared until his neck ached. He wondered what that boy would think if he saw what flying meant now. On the other side of the war, Sato sat alone beside his Zero. Lantern light wavered on aluminum. Mechanics had patched the bullet holes. Paint covered the scars, but not the memory. He ran a hand along the fuselage as if reading Braille. He'd sent many men to their deaths in lighter days. The tide had shifted. He could feel it in the hum of the earth. His young pilot still believed the old magic. That courage alone could bend physics. He no longer did. Courage was a candle, altitude was wind. He wrote a brief note in his logbook. New enemy fighter superior in climb, armor, and firepower. Avoid vertical engagement, seek advantage in surprise, numbers, and faith. He underlined the last word without irony. The night deepened. Crickets droned somewhere inland. Sato looked up at a sky full of indifferent stars. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we learn if spirits still fly faster than bullets." Dawn came gray and cold. Steam rose from the carrier deck as the engines warmed, a chorus of growls rising into harmony. Deck crews wore yellow vests and expressions that said everything except fear. Baker climbed into his Hellcat. The canopy closed with the sound of finality. Over the radio, static gave way to the launch officer's clipped tone. "Green deck. Launch." The catapult slammed him into the morning. His stomach stayed behind for half a heartbeat. Then the sea dropped away and the world became a geometry of clouds and purpose. He checked his formation. Flaherty on his right, two new pilots behind. The sun was low. Good. You could hide in it. 50 miles east, Sato's flight of 8 climbed through scattered clouds, their bellies silver in the early light. The island fell away beneath them, small as gilt. Both groups were heading for the same horizon. They saw each other almost at the same moment. Two dark shoals of fish glimpsed through clear water, currents set to collide. The dive bombers droned below like monks chanting a vow. Baker flexed his fingers once on the stick, a superstition he would deny later, and pushed the nose a hair to keep the sun where he wanted it, a blade at his back. "Bandits, 11 high," Flaherty said, steady as if reading a weather report. "Hold altitude," Baker replied. "We're the rooftop." "Let them come up the stairs." Sato split his 8 in a quiet fan, 2 sections to probe, 1 to guard the climb. The Americans had learned restraint. So would he. Patience is a turn no one sees. The first passes were fast, clean. The Hellcat slashed down, stitching the air with short, disciplined bursts, then rose again as if pulled by string. Zeros tried to lure them into a flat dance, each offering a tempting circle like a ring dropped on the floor. The Grummans declined with cold manners. They would not be courted. They court-martialed. Baker tracked a glinting zero that seemed to swell and shrink in his sight like breath. He eased lead, squeezed. The 50s spoke in one voice. A panel fluttered off the Zero's wing. It snapped into a skid, recovered, then kicked hard into a roll that saved the pilot and forfeited the fight. Baker did not chase. Altitude is money. Don't tip the house. Below, the Dauntlesses rolled into their dives. The island rose to meet them with black flowers of flak. One bomber took a hit that lifted it visibly, then it kept diving anyway, a stubborn prayer in metal. The Hellcats widened their circle of guardianship, a crown of thorns around the ritual. Sato chose his moment. He climbed into a space between two Americans, knife edge, and held it until the flight engineer of the universe seemed to frown. Then he fell, not onto the bombers, but across the Hellcat's geometry, a diagonal insult. His tracers licked a Grumman's cowl. Sparks drooled from the engine lip. The pilot yanked, overcorrected, and Sato's wingman finished the mistake like punctuation at the end of a sentence. "Splash Blue 3, someone said in Baker's headphones, voice blown thin by wind. Baker felt the squeeze of the harness and something else, anger rounded to a point. He rolled, counted 1, 2, then let the nose drop into the groove. The Zero that had scored the kill flashed in his windscreen like a dare. He refused the dare, chose Sato instead, the one who'd carved the opening. Not revenge. Repair. Sato sensed the shadow before he saw the shape. He kicked rudder, traded a little speed for angle, and the first American burst smudged air where his cockpit had been. He smiled without pleasure. Good. A thinker. Let's see what he forgets when the oxygen gets thin. They climbed. The world thinned to a chalky blue, the island reduced to a postcard shoved under glass. Baker felt the engine's insistence in his bones. He was not chasing. He was shepherding. He slid right, kept the sun as a coin he could spend. Sato refused to be driven into a simple line. He curved his climb, a painter's stroke, and then, there, he snapped through the top and fell left, hoping the American would overshoot. Baker didn't. He unloaded, let the nose dip just enough to keep speed, and arced into the fall with him. For a heartbeat, both planes were weightless ideas, then gravity filed its claim and the fight steepened. Radio clutter scratched at the edges. 2 bogies low, flak heavy at the bend. Dauntlesses off target, rally south. Watch your 6. The battle had gone from set piece to storm. Baker's wingman called, "You're clean for now," and then, almost tenderly, "Spend it." Baker spent it. 2 short bursts at the moment Sato's wing blotted the sun. The tracers tracked the arc perfectly and missed. Not by inches, by intention. Sato had thrown the Zero into a skid so ugly it might have been considered art, a move that would have broken a heavier plane. The Hellcat flashed past, and for an instant, Baker saw Sato's face turn toward him, pale, focused, neither angry nor afraid. Just present. They crossed again. Sato tried to drag Baker down into flak, aggressive humility disguised as retreat. Baker refused the pull. He climbed, banking energy in a vault no shell could touch, and counted breaths. He felt the urge to chase like a thirst in his mouth. He swallowed it. Flaherty's voice. On your left, 2 more climbing. Copy. We'll take the far one on the bounce. Sato saw the pair and adjusted. 3 quick corrections so small a ground observer would have called it a straight line. He would trade lives for angles if he had to. The new American fighter deserved that respect. The dive came like a verdict. Baker broke from the sun again, but this time he didn't aim at Sato. He aimed ahead of where Sato would choose not to be. When Sato juked the expected juke, the sight was already there, waiting. Baker squeezed one hard, disciplined pull. The Zero shuddered as if remembering a promise. A strip of skin peeled from the right wing. The plane lurched into a slow right-hand sag. Sato corrected, held it, put the nose down to keep control. Smoke feathered from the seam. A sensible man would disengage. Sato had always considered himself sensible. He pushed the throttle and asked the Zero for one last clean line. It gave him something close. The island's flak wrote angry cursive between them now. Baker jinked, lost the sight picture, found it again. He would not descend into the maelstrom. The math was wrong. He let Sato go almost. Then the Zero, crippled but proud, tried to climb a little, just a little, and the opportunity walked back into the room. Last pass, Baker said. Then we're done. He rolled shallow, eased the nose, and fired a final, short burst. Surgical, almost apologetic. The bullet stitched along the Zero's spine. The canopy popped open like a lid. The plane yawed, steadied, then began a gentle, unstoppable right turn that only the ground could end. Baker pulled up, heart too big for the cage of his ribs. He did not watch the impact. He climbed back into the cool, into the numbers, into the duty he owed the men who were still alive because he had stayed where he was supposed to stay. The Dauntlesses reformed like veterans of a difficult hymn. The island burned in competent rectangles. The sea collected wreckage without comment. Rally south, came the order. Home plate. Baker looked once at the empty quadrant where a Zero had been an idea of a man, then turned for the carrier. Flaherty slid into place off his wing, waggled once, and said nothing. The sky behind them kept its secrets, turning the color of nothing in particular. The deck crews saw them coming before the lookouts called it. 3 Hellcats returning as 2. Men don't count on their fingers. They count by absences. A yellow shirt ran a palm along his jaw and didn't say the name he was not seeing. Baker's wheels kissed the steel and the hook bit like a faithful dog. The plane thumped, shrugged, rolled, and stopped. He opened the canopy and the world rushed in. Salt, hot oil, a breath of smoke from a fire far away. Hands reached the wings, the ladder, his shoulder. He climbed down into a company of men who had perfected the art of not asking the first question. In the ready room, the chalkboard filled itself. Sorties, kills, losses, damage. The marks looked like a math problem written by a tired god. Baker wrote one neat line. 1-0, probable confirmed, and next to it, black 3. Missing. He pressed the chalk too hard. It snapped cleanly in the middle. The CO moved through the room, touching shoulders, speaking in a voice that left no fingerprints. You kept your altitudes. Good work. We lost blue 3 and black 3. Next briefing at 1700. Debrief in 10. Flaherty sat with both elbows on his knees, helmet dangling from a finger. You got the fox, he said, a compliment that sounded like a eulogy. Maybe, Baker answered. It cost us either way. That's how costs work. They went through the debrief like craftsmen reviewing a build. Where did you first sight? What was your entry? Why did you press or break? No one accused the dead of mistakes. They simply wrote better instructions for the living. Across the water, Sato's squadron head counted who had rolled home on their scarred wheels and who had not. He took a tour of the runway's edge with his eyes, as if the missing might be hiding there, late for supper. A mechanic approached, hat in hand, eyes tilted down in the respectful angle bad news requires. Sato nodded before the man spoke. I know. He wrote 3 more names in the log and paused on Aoki's, too young a name, all quick strokes. He placed the pen down very carefully as if it could go off. At dusk, Baker walked the deck. The ocean had forgiven the afternoon. It wore a new face, gray and blank, like fresh paper. He ran a hand along the Hellcat's wounded paint. Holes had been patched, edges taped in a hurry that somehow looked artful. The plane's engine clicked and softened as it cooled, a large animal falling asleep. He thought about the Zero he had not watched hit the ground. In his head, he had already invented a story for the pilot. Calm, skilled, maybe the sort who would have helped lift a fallen bicycle from a child's leg on some Tokyo street. The story was unprovable and therefore kind. He let it stand. Flaherty joined him, handed over a mug of coffee that managed to be both terrible and perfect. "They'll say the cat changed the war," Flaherty said. Baker shrugged. "Ships. Fuel, luck, training, all of it. The cat just let us use the rest." "Still," Flaherty said, tapping the fuselage with two knuckles, "I like flying a plane that forgives me when I'm almost good enough." They watched a sailor chalk fresh lines on the deck. The man's movements were ordinary and heroic in equal amounts. The ship breathed, the crew moved, and the evening unrolled. Weeks later, the pattern repeated until patterns became fate. Launch, climb, escort, strike, duel, tally, return. The Hellcat earned a reputation with the numb inevitability of statistics. Kill ratios spoken in halting tones, numbers that felt obscene to say aloud. Pilots rotated home with hair a little whiter at the edges, others rotated in with eyes too clean. Sato's unit shrank, refilled, shrank again, a tide that returned fewer shells each time. And yet, even in a ledger that brutal, there were mercies. A forced landing on a beach where fishermen risked quiet kindness. A parachute caught in a palm that did not break. A captured pilot who lived long enough to see his enemy offer a cigarette like a truce between men who both preferred the sky. On a later mission, one of those whose exact date evaporates in memory, Baker found himself above an expanse of cloud as smooth as poured plaster. He leveled off, alone for a minute that felt stolen. The engine's note steadied into a hymn. He thought, not of victories or losses, but of the way the Hellcat had taught him to live inside restraint. Don't chase the decoy, hold your height, pick your fight, spend only what you can afford to miss. War would end, they promised. Planes would go to museums, to boneyards, to children's drawings taped to refrigerators. Men would go to kitchens and porches and last names, but some lessons would refuse to retire. The sky, like a stern teacher, had graded everything with clarity. He turned the nose gently toward home. The carrier was a small punctuation mark far off, waiting to finish his sentence. The cat purred, forgiving, strong, a tool that had done exactly what it was made to do. Somewhere beyond the reach of radios and after-action reports, Sato, if he had survived that day, might have been looking at a different horizon, calculating his own proofs. Courage is not enough. Finesse dies without fuel. Skill starves without altitude. Perhaps years later he would nod at a museum placard that got part of the story right and part wrong, and think, we underestimated the cat. Then we met the truth of it. And perhaps Baker, older, slower, gentler, would read the same placard and think not of ratios or reputations, but of the way the morning sun looked on aluminum, the weight of a mug in a ready room, the silence after landing, when the engine clicked itself back into stillness. They had laughed at the Hellcat. It did not laugh back. It simply climbed and dived and came home. When peace finally came, it arrived without trumpets. No skywriting, no drum roll, no single word that could make sense of the years. It came instead as a silence that felt too wide. The carriers went home trailing ribbons of exhaust and memory. Men stepped onto docks that smelled of diesel and rain, and didn't quite know how to walk on land again. Baker packed his duffel under a sun that had forgotten how to hide. The Hellcat that had carried him through the war sat in its final place, nose pointed toward a hangar, wings folded like a bird that had earned its rest. He ran a hand along the metal one last time. The paint was chipped, the markings faded, but the skin was warm, alive somehow. "You did all right," he murmured. The crew chief looked up from his clipboard. "You talking to it or to yourself?" Baker smiled. "Both." He didn't think of the missions, not at first. He thought of the small things. The smell of coffee at dawn, the rattle of the catapult before launch, the way a wingman's silhouette looked against the sunrise. War had taught him a strange kind of gratitude. Not for violence, but for precision, for survival shared in fractions of seconds. Months later, the Hellcat sat in a training field, stripped of ammunition and glory. Cadets climbed in and out of it, learning switches, checklists, the language of flight that had cost others so much to invent. They didn't know the stories written into its rivets. They didn't hear the voices that once filled the radio with clipped, calm courage. But sometimes, in the quiet after an engine test, the old plane seemed to hum to itself, a ghost of the ocean wind moving through its bones. In Tokyo, Sato survived. He spent 3 years repairing civilian cargo planes, finding comfort in the honesty of tools. His hands, which had once danced over flight controls, now turned wrenches. He never spoke of the war except to say, "The air is the same everywhere. It forgives no one." One afternoon in 1951, an American flight demonstration came to Haneda. On the tarmac gleamed a single restored Hellcat, flown in for display. Sato stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand. The plane taxied, its big prop carving the air into order, its engine note deep and confident, the same sound that had once haunted his nights. When it lifted from the runway, he felt no hatred, only understanding. Machines had never been enemies. They were instruments of whatever heart sat behind the throttle. He watched until the aircraft vanished into a cloudless sky, and for the first time in years he allowed himself a small, private smile. "Beautiful," he said softly in English, surprising himself. Years later, museums would polish Hellcats to mirror shine, setting them under spotlights beside plaques that spoke of victory in numbers. Visitors would read that the F6F achieved a kill ratio of 19-1. Cold arithmetic that said everything and nothing. Few paused to imagine the hands that had built it, the fear inside each mission, the silent prayer before the catapult fired. Baker did. He visited one once in a Midwest museum not far from where he'd been a boy, watching biplanes over county fairs. The Hellcat stood tall even in retirement, thick-shouldered, defiant. A family passed behind him, a child pointed up and said, "Dad, that one looks slow." The father chuckled. "It was strong," he said. Baker smiled and whispered, "And smart." He traced the curve of a wing with his eyes, following the lines to where sky began again beyond the glass roof. Somewhere out there, the same currents still moved. Invisible, patient, eternal. Men would always return to them, in peace or war, to measure themselves against what could not be tamed. He turned to leave, but paused, looking once more at the placard. F6F Hellcat. The plane that turned the tide of the Pacific. He thought of Flaherty's grin, of the letters never sent, of the Japanese pilot who had earned his respect by trying to kill him. He thought of mornings that began with fear and ended with gratitude, of the way the sea looked from 15,000 feet. Blue without apology. As he stepped into daylight, Baker realized the war had not given him wisdom so much as perspective. Some things break and never mend, others bend and survive. The Hellcat had been built to bend. The wind that met him outside was cool, steady, and familiar. He closed his eyes, listening. For an instant, he could almost hear the old engine again, climbing through time, patient and unstoppable. They had laughed at the Hellcat, and then it taught them what power really sounded like.